Setting: a debating hall in Maithili. On a low table beside Genjesha sit a smoking lamp, an unlit second lamp, and, half in shadow, a common clay jar. Sutradhara enters. Every builder tests his mortar before he trusts it with a wall. Genjesha Upadhyaya before he would let logic carry the weight of a single conclusion, before he would let it prove that fire causes smoke, or that a maker stands behind the world, tested the mortar first. What, exactly, is a valid piece of knowledge? What, exactly, does it mean for one thing to be invariably tied to another? He would not move an inch until the definition itself could survive every attack he could throw at it, including his own. He tells us plainly, in his own opening verses, who he built this fortress against: the Buddhist logicians of his day, who denied an unseen maker of the world as confidently as they denied an unseen self. Tonight, one of them has come to test the fortress in person. Watch how Genjesha answers him, not by shouting louder, but by defining more precisely than any opponent thought possible, and then, more than once, precisely enough to catch his own first attempt in the same net. Act 1. The Inattentive Scholar. G. A letter 1E45 G. E. S. Acute is seated, a lamp burning beside him. The MI Macron MA Macron letter 1E43 S. Akea and the border are both present.
Every author who begins a work performs an invocation, wishing the work to be completed. I have done the same tonight. Before I ask anyone in this hall to accept a harder claim, let me test the easiest one first. Does an invocation actually cause anything at all?
A fair place to start, and I will not let you past it cheaply.
If invocation causes completion, the two should rise and fall together, present when the work is finished, absent when it fails.
But I can name your scholar in this very tradition, Udayana himself, by report, in an inattentive hour, who completed the Kurunivali without troubling to perform any invocation worth the name.
There is your counter-instance. The rule breaks in the very house that claims to have invented it.
That example close, friend, because I intend to use it against you before this act is finished. Not merely answer it, but let me first grant you the full force of your objection. Honestly stated, if a cause and its effect are truly bound, the effect should never appear without it, nor the cause without eventually producing it. Udayana's work was completed. His invocation, on your account, was absent or careless. On the surface, you have shown a deviation, and deviation is fatal to any claim to causal law.
Then you concede the point.
I concede the appearance of the point, which is a different concession entirely. Consider what an invocation is actually said to produce, not the completion itself, directly, as though chanting a verse with laid bricks, but the removal of an obstacle that would otherwise have interrupted the work. A worldly task, once its obstacles are cleared, completes itself by worldly means: skill, materials, sustained effort. Now ask of your inattentive scholar, was his work, on that particular day, ever actually obstructed? If no obstacle stood in his path to begin with, there was nothing for an invocation to remove, and its absence proves nothing at all. A locksmith's absence does not deviate from the rule that locksmiths open locks on a day when no door happened to be locked.
A convenient rescue. How would you ever know in advance whether an obstacle was lying in wait or not? You have made your causal law untestable. It now explains success and failure equally, which is another way of saying it explains nothing.
Not untestable, only, like most causal claims worth having, tied to a condition rather than announced as unconditional. Fire causes smoke only where the fuel is wet enough to smolder. Dry fuel burns clean, and no one calls that a deviation in the law connecting fire and smoke. You are asking me to abandon a rule because it is a condition attached, when every rule either of us has ever relied on, from the kitchen to this hall, carries the same kind of condition.
Then let me press you from my own side, Genjesha, since the border and I do not usually stand on the same ground. Grant that invocation removes obstacles rather than manufacturing completion directly. Still, how is that removal known, if not by the very Vedic injunction that first taught cultivated persons to perform it before an undertaking? Strip away scriptural authority and your causal chain has no first link.
I will not strip it away. I never proposed to. Revelation tells us the general rule, ordinary observation of cultivated persons, generation after generation, performing this act before this kind of task, confirms that the rule is no idle poetry. Where the two agree, as they do here, a cause may be trusted precisely as we trust any cause established by steady, repeated, unexplained by coincidence, correlation, the very method border that you yourself use every time you infer fire from smoke without demanding to see the fire directly.
You have kept your promise, Ikaria. You did use my own example against me in the end.
And I will keep making that same promise all evening. I never asked you to accept an unseen cause on faith. I ask only that you extend to my unseen causes the same courtesy of inference you already extend, without a second thought, to your own.
Act 2. The shell that was never silver. A servant places a shell on the low table beside the jar. G. A letter 1E45 G. Executor gestures toward it.
Before we build anything further, we must agree what we mean by true cognition in the first place, not what is true, but what makes a cognition true as opposed to merely occurring. Here is my first attempt that cognition is valid when it presents a property exactly where the property actually exists. I see silver, and silver is there, valid. I see silver in this shell, and silver is not there, invalid.
That sounds almost too simple to need saying, Ikaria.
Everything simple in this science has already survived an ambush, or it would not be standing here simple in front of you. Watch the ambush now. Take the confused cognition, common enough at dusk. The shell is silver. Test my definition against it. Honestly, the shell component of the cognition, to bear this, is placed correctly, since the shell truly is there. The silver component is placed wrongly, since no silver is there. One cognition, one sentence, and yet by my own definition is simultaneously valid in one half and invalid in the other.
Is that not simply a contradiction in your definition?
It would be, if a cognition were forced to be valid or invalid as one indivisible lump, but a cognition of this shell silver is not one indivisible claim. It is two claims used by a single glance, one about this, one about silverness, and each half may be tested against the world separately, exactly as a sentence with two clauses may have one clause true and the other false without breaking the law of non-contradiction. My definition survives, once we are honest about what a compound cognition actually contains.
Then extend the test one step further and see whether it survives me.
A tree stands before us conjunction with a bird sits at its crown. An absence of that same conjunction sits at its root.
By your definition, is the cognition this tree is conjunction valid or invalid?
You have set the trap cleverly, and I will walk into it on purpose, because the way out is instructive. Conjunction and its absence do not occupy the whole tree indiscriminately. One occupies the crown, the other the root, and a cognition properly delimited by which part is being spoken of is neither vague nor self-contradicting. The tree, at its crown, as conjunction is true. The tree, at its root, lacks it is equally true. Only a cognition that refused to specify a part would deserve your accusation, and no careful speaker leaves a cognition so undressed.
You're adding conditions to your definition faster than I can raise objections to it. At what point does a definition patched this many times stop being a definition and become a confession that the first attempt failed?
When a physician adjusts a splint twice before the bone sets straight, we do not say the splint failed. We say the physician was honest about the first attempt and skilled enough to correct it before trusting a patient's full weight to it. I would rather hand you a definition with 3 patches, each of which has survived your best blow, than a single elegant sentence that shatters the moment you lean on it. Test it once more if you have another blow in you.
One more then, and it is the sharpest I have. A pot freshly made was black before firing and is red after. This pot is black was once true and is now false. The very same sentence about the very same pot changing its truth, with nothing in your definition to explain why.
Because my definition was never a claim about sentences floating free of time, it was, from the start, a claim about a property residing in a substrate at a given time, exactly as it resides in a given part. The pot, before firing, was black remains true forever, unchanged by the kiln. This pot, now, is black was always a different claim, tied to a different moment, and is no defect in a rule that it answers a time-indexed question with a time-indexed answer. The kiln did not break my definition. It only proved that whoever forgets to specify when was never speaking carefully enough to test it in the first place.
I begin to see why this book took a lifetime to write.
It took a lifetime because every sentence in it is already set across from an opponent exactly as sharp as the one sitting across from me tonight. That is not a complaint, friend. That is the only kind of sentence worth building anything further upon.
Act 3. The bond between smoke and fire. The lamp beside G, a letter 1E45 GE executor is trimmed. Smoke curls faintly from its wick.
We are ready now for the engine of every inference. Either of us will ever make the bond called viati, the invariable tie between a mark, such as smoke, and what it proves, such as fire. Without a precise account of that tie, Smoke, therefore fire, is a habit, not a proof. Here is a first attempt to the tie holds when the mark never occurs where the thing to be proven is absent.
Simple, and I think already broken. Consider a purely affirmative claim with no counter instance available anywhere to test. This is nameable because it is knowable.
Everything knowable happens also to be nameable. There exists no case anywhere of knowable but unnameable in which your never occurs, where absent could even be checked.
Your definition asks me to search a field that has no far corner to search.
You have found a genuine gap, and I will not paper over it. I abandon the first attempt outright, here in front of this hall, exactly as readily as I abandoned my first definition of valid cognition and actido. Let me try again the tie holds when the mark's own locus is never distinct from the locus of what it proves.
No better.
Restate it in terms of smoke
And fire occurring
in different places, and the same gap reappears wherever no such different place can even be imagined to test it against.
Correct again, and here is a third attempt, and a fourth, each closing a door the last one left open, until we reach the one I am prepared to defend against every blow you have already landed, and every one you have not yet thought to try. The tie is collocation itself, the mark reciting together with what it proves, in such a way that the mark's own presence is never found in a place determined, however indirectly, by the true and complete absence of what it proves. Test the mount now. Smoke rises from it. Fire, somewhere on it, is collocated with that very smoke. Nowhere is there an absence of firing general standing in the same place as the particular smoke. The tie holds, stated with no gap left for corner case to hide in.
You have built 4 definitions to survive one example.
Forgive me if I am not yet dazzled.
Bedazzled by the method, now the count. Notice what I did not do at any point in these 4 attempts. I did not simply assert my conclusion and dare you to disprove it. I built the weakest version of my own claim first, on purpose, and let you, or twice, let myself, break it before a stronger version was proposed. A wall tested 4 times by its own mason and left standing is worth more than a wall no one has yet thought to push.
But Akaria, how do we ever come to know such a tie in the first place once it is properly defined? I have seen smoke and fire together in a kitchen. I have not seen every fire in the world.
By repeated observation, joined to the failure of any single case, however hard sought, to break the pattern, and, where repetition alone leaves a shadow of doubt, by further support your Buddhist friend himself half rants without noticing if smoke could truly arise apart from fire, then smoke's very dependence on fire, the fact that smoldering fuel, and only smoldering fuel, sends up the particular gray column, would be an unexplained coincidence repeating itself in every kitchen, on every mountain, in every age, with no exception ever once observed by anyone. A coincidence that never fails is no longer usefully called a coincidence. It has earned the harder name lore.
Act 4. An agent behind the clay. G. The letter 1E45 G. E. Executor lifts the jar from the table and sets it before the assembly.
Every argument this evening has been sharpening a single tool. Now I put the tool to its hardest use. Earth and the other elements of this world are effects, produced, arisen, not eternal, exactly as this jar is an effect. Nothing produced lacks a producer. Therefore, earth and the other elements have a maker, precisely as this jar has a potter.
Before I attack the argument's body, I will attack its skeleton, and I promise you this is not evasion. It is the same discipline you demanded of me all evening. What precisely is the subject of this inference? You cannot simply say earth and the other elements, because no single word denotes each of them individually, and no single recurring feature unites them into one collective subject either.
Name your subject precisely in your own idiom, or the inference has nowhere to stand before it has even begun.
A demand I would have made of you, had our positions been reversed, and I answer it in kind rather than waiting it aside. Let the subject be whatever is in effect, and is not already known by both of us to be produced by an embodied human agent. That excludes the jar, which we both already agree was made by a potter, and it excludes nothing that remains genuinely in dispute between us.
Too narrow, and dangerously so.
On that phrasing, a sprout, produced certainly, yet by no embodied craftsman either, falls inside your subject as readily as earth does. Prove your conclusion for the sprout instead, quietly, and you have proven something, but you have not proven the maker of worlds. You have only smuggled a small, unremarkable case into the same door and called it the same victory.
A precise objection, and I will not answer it by softening the subject further, which is the tempting mistake. I will answer it by refusing to let the sprout stand in for earth at all. The sprout was never the disputed topic between us tonight. Earth was, and inference proves its conclusion only for the subject actually named at its outset. and if I quietly substitute a sprout partway through, I would have committed the very fault I spent an act ago accusing you of hiding inside a definition, changing the ground beneath an argument once it grew inconvenient. The subject remains earth, water, fire, air, taken as the genuinely disputed effects they are. The sprout may wait its own evening.
Then narrow it correctly yourself, since you reject my narrowing.
Say plainly, agency here means being produced by someone possessing direct knowledge of the material cause, desire to act, and effort. The very three things a potter has standing before his wheel.
I very nearly said exactly that a moment ago, and I am glad you forced me to test it before I leaned on it, because it collapses under its own weight. You and I both already possess knowledge, desire, and effort concerning countless material causes every single day, and yet Earth as a whole is plainly not produced by either of us on the strength of that ordinary knowledge and desire alone. If agency meant nothing more than the bare presence of those three faculties in some person or other, the property would already be satisfied 1,000 times over by ordinary living beings, and my inference would prove nothing it did not already have to assume.
Then you have refuted your own proof faster than I could have managed it myself tonight.
I have refuted my own careless proof, which is a different achievement than refuting the proof itself, and it is exactly the achievement this entire evening has been training the hall to recognize as progress rather than defeat. What the argument actually requires is narrower still an agent whose knowledge, desire, and effort were not merely present alongside the production of her, as mine happened to be present alongside found things I never caused, but are the effective cause of it, standing in the same causal relation to earth that the potter's knowledge, desire, and effort stand to this jar, and not merely keeping the same company as or its production the way an idle bystander keeps company with a fire he did not light.
And can that narrower agency be found among us, Akaria, some embodied person, however hidden, who might satisfy it after all?
Test it honestly and see where it leads. An embodied agent's effort presupposes a body, on every account either of us accepts, is itself among the produced things requiring exactly this kind of maker. To explain Earth by appeal to some earlier embodied agent is to borrow against a debt that was never paid. Every candidate you offer me from within the world of bodies turns out to owe its own existence to the very kind of cause we are trying to locate. The chain cannot terminate in an embodied maker without either running back forever, unexplained, or stopping, at last, at a knower, a willer, and an actor whose effort does not itself depend on a body already owed to some further maker. That is the whole of what I mean by God, and no more not a larger man, but the one link in the chain of makers who does not himself require prior maker to be there at all.
You have spent an entire evening refusing to let either of us take a shortcut, not through my objections, and twice tonight, not through your own first answers either.
I do not yet call myself persuaded.
But I no longer believe, as I did when I sat down, that this conclusion was reached by skipping a single step available to skip.
That is the only outcome I have ever asked this hall for. I did not come here tonight to win an argument by speaking last. I came to build one sentence at a time, in front of witnesses sharp enough to catch me if any single stone in the wall was set carelessly. If the wall stands, it will not be because I raised my voice at the end. It will be because nothing in it was left untested by the time the lamp burned down.
Sutradhara returns as the lamp is lowered. Notice what this evening was not. It was not louder than the debates that came before it in other halls, on other nights, over other books. Genjesha Upadilea's whole method was the opposite of volume. State the claim as weakly and precisely as honesty allows. Invite the sharpest blow available, and if the blow lands, thank the opponent and rebuild rather than bluster past the wound. He called his book a wish-fulfilling jewel, and told us plainly in its own first lines whose darkness he meant it to clear. The powerful doubt of the Buddhist logicians of his age, who granted no unseen cause behind anything, neither an invocation's power nor a world's maker. He did not answer that doubt by refusing to feel its weight. He answered it by insisting 4 times over in one evening alone that his own first answer had not yet earned the right to stand unchallenged. Whether that is the same thing as being right, this hall leaves, as it always does, to the one who carries the question out the door. Exeunt omnes.